Why do so many people reject God? And that's a question we as Christians consider on a daily basis. Certainly many answers could be given, but one answer is that of why should I serve a supposedly good God who allows bad things to happen? Millions are the people who are unequipped or who find themselves surprised when bad things happen. So many act as if bad things should not happen to them in this present world, or that bad things should happen. Thus, when life seems unfair, or when troubles come, or bad things happen, the tendency on the part of human beings is to blame God. Because of this tendency we have as humans to blame God, many are those who have built up hatred in their hearts for the God of heaven because they cannot understand how or fathom how such a good, loving, and benevolent God could allow bad things to take place. So as Christians, we are faced with a challenge. There's no doubt about that. We are faced with the challenge of trying to reach these individuals who hold such animosity toward God. We're faced with trying to reach them with the gospel. And indeed, the gospel is for all. It's even for them who despise God. Let's not kid ourselves about that. We have a responsibility to reach out to them. But yet at the same time, if we are to reach them, we must meet the challenge of answering their attacks against God. They question God, and thus when they ask questions, we must be willing, we must be prepared to answer them. 1 Peter 3, verse number 15 would tell us to be ready to give an answer. And thus there is the need for us to come to a better understanding of God, of who we are as human beings, and what we need to do when life throws us a curve, when life seems unfair. So tonight, as we concern ourselves with the problems of evil in this world, as we concern ourselves with the problem of human pain, as we think about suffering and death, and as we think about our faith in the God of heaven, we are working under the title tonight of When Life Seems Unfair. In this lesson, we're going to examine the reality of evil and suffering in this present world, and really these two things go hand in hand. They all ultimately tie together at some point. And the reason why God permits it to occur by looking at, first of all, some questions men have raised, thus spurring on their rejection of God. We're going to look at the true origination of evil, what we mean by evil, and again, evil has been redefined so many times that it's hard to really get a true, good, working definition of it. We're going to consider why we suffer, why men suffer, why God allows it to occur, and what it can do for us if we allow it or permit it. Our objective then is threefold tonight. We want to show, number one, that evil, in the most restricted and biblical sense, is the result of poor choices made by men. Thus, human suffering is a direct and indirect result of bad decision making, and we'll explain as we go through the lesson tonight. And number two, we're going to show that our faith in the all-powerful and all-good God is not irrational, as atheists, as skeptics would claim as a result of the existence of evil. No doubt that it can be problematic, but it can be answered. And that our faith in Him can be strengthened, in that suffering and that pain and that calamity can draw us closer to God. And again, if we allow these things to, it comes down to our disposition. And number three, we're going to demonstrate it is not evil on the part of the all-good God to allow evil to exist in this present world. And again, we're going to show this and answer these questions throughout this lesson tonight. So as we get into things, let's first of all briefly set forth some of the questions that men have raised, that man poses. Why is there evil? Why is there so much suffering in this world? What is the purpose of evil and suffering? Why must it occur? Where is God in all of this? Why doesn't God stop evil? Why does God allow me to suffer? Why does God allow me to experience pain? Why does God allow death to occur? Does there have to be so much evil? Does there have to be so much pain? Does there have to be so much suffering? Couldn't God have made a world without evil? But ultimately it comes down to the personal question. Why do I have to suffer? Why does bad things happen to me? These are the questions men ask. And many of these are good and they're proper and they demand an answer. And many times there are those who ask them sincerely. But then there are those who would erect these as straw men to try to discredit the God of heaven or to justify their denial that there is a God in heaven. And hence we see their rejection of God. And part of the reason why many reject God is based on the problem of evil in this world, is based on the problem of pain and suffering. And the charge is made, where is God? If there is a God, why doesn't he stop evil and suffering? And this is a charge that has been asked throughout the ages. Greek philosopher Epicurus asked, whence evil, if there be a God? From there, the Scottish skeptic David Hume asked, is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? So in other words, he is presenting a threefold charge against God. If God is willing to prevent evil but is not doing so, then he claims that God is impotent or powerless. On the other hand, Hume then comes at it by asking, is God able but not willing? Then he's claiming that he is a vicious or a violent and malevolent God. But then then he comes at him from a third avenue. If this God of heaven is able and willing and he doesn't do anything about it, then he has to be an evil God and not worth serving. And that's the basic attack of the atheist. Further, Charles Smith, who is the first president of the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, he stated in a debate with Brother W.L. Oliphant and this was back in 1929. He stated in this debate regarding God's existence that either God wishes to destroy evil and cannot, or he can but will not, or neither wishes nor has the power, or he both desires and is able. If he can but will not, he is wicked. Now notice he uses the similar arguments that David Hume did. He goes on to say, if he neither wishes nor can, he is impotent as well as wicked. If he can and will, why does evil exist? And this is the problem that these individuals have. J.L. Mackie, in an article entitled Evil and Omnipotence, argues that if a good omnipotent entity exists, then evil does not exist. Or if evil exists, then no good omnipotent entity exists. In other words, it's either this or this for the atheist. There's no middle ground. They want to go to extremes. And they don't want to rationalize with the truth of the matter that God created us, that we are created, that we were endowed with a conscience, that we were endowed with the ability to think and to reason and to make choices. That's the idea of free moral agency, of free will. And we should be thankful for this. Other words, what good would it be if we just went around, if we were created as just emotionless, pre-programmed robots who were pre-programmed to serve God? Would God receive any glory in that? Would there be any glory in just creating a race of individual creatures, human beings, that were pre-programmed to serve their Creator without being able to choose to do so willingly? Well, there's no glory in that. God created us with the ability to choose, and He wants us to make the correct choice to serve Him. For when we do so, when we willingly submit our lives to Him, we give Him the glory, and He is honored by our lives. The atheist logical argument is designed thusly in Norman Geisler in his excellent work on apologetics and his encyclopedia on Christian apologetics formulates it thusly. He says, if God is all good, he would destroy evil. He also, their second premise is, if God is all powerful, he could destroy. Now notice how they're attacking. They're coming at it from the perspective of the goodness and the power of God. But they claim evil is not destroyed. However, they conclude as a result of evil's presence that there is no God, therefore there is no such God. In other words, their argument is, how can an all-powerful and an all-good God let bad things happen to people? In reality, they are appealing to emotions rather than common sense reasoning. And so, let me give you a couple of examples that really get to the heart of the lesson tonight, why it was requested. Dan Barker, co-founder of the Freedom from Religion Association, and we've heard that in the news a lot lately. Whenever people attempt to pray to God in public places, they're the first ones to come to the forefront offended and wanting to bring lawsuits. But Barker, in a 2009 debate with Brother Kyle Budd of Apologetics Press, in defending his proposition that God does not exist, Barker said that there are no good replies to the arguments against the existence of God, such as the problem of evil. Barker goes on to say, all you have to do is walk into any children's hospital and you know there is no God. That's what Barker says. He says prayer doesn't make any difference. These people pray for their beloved children to live and they die. And that's a basic argument that those who reject God will make in an attempt to discredit the existence of God. They will say, how could God let these little children die and let others live? But let me give you another example as we build this foundation, as we concern ourselves, first of all, with the rejection of the God of heaven. In 2012, after the massacre in Connecticut, Susan and I and the boys were living in Blount County at the time. We were driving home from Birmingham. And a radio talk show host by the name of Jerry Doyle, and I remember this was on 105.5 WERC out of Birmingham. And Jerry Doyle went on a diatribe on his show against God. He wanted to know where God was when this happened. Why God didn't stop it. Why God permitted it. And he went on to say that all who believe in God ought to either question their faith in him or question whether he really exists. So we see how they are approaching. When bad things happen, they say, well, that such a good and all-powerful God cannot exist. If he did, he would stop these things. Yet conversely, consider how David reacted when the child born from an adulterous relationship with Bathsheba died. In 2 Samuel chapters 12, beginning with verse number 16, and we're very familiar with the events that led up to this. David sinned in his adultery with Bathsheba. He tried to cover up his affair from Uriah, ultimately led to the death of the innocent man. Nathan confronted him about it, and ultimately David confessed his sin, that he had sinned against God, yet there would be consequences to that sin. In verse number 16 of chapter 11, of chapter 12, I'm in chapter 11. David besought God, David pleaded with God for the child, David fasted, went in, and lay all night upon the earth. Verse 17, the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the earth, but he would not, neither did he eat bread with them. And it came to pass on the seventh day that the child died. And the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, behold, while the child was yet alive, we spake unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead? But when David saw that his servants whispered, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said unto his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. Now notice with me in verse 20. Notice how David took this. Then David arose from the earth, and washed and anointed himself and changed his apparel and came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Notice that. First thing he did was worship God. Then he came to his own house, and when he required, they set bread before him, and he did eat. Then said his servants unto him, What thing is this that thou hast done? Now they're very surprised at David. Why aren't you cursing God? Why are you blaming God? Why are you going through all this? Why are you worshiping God? Why are you eating a meal? Yeah, you did fast and weep for the child while it was alive, but when the child was dead, thou didst rise and eat bread. Now, verse 22. David says, While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, Who can tell whether God will be gracious to me, that the child may live? But now he is dead. Wherefore should I fast? Well, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? Now, I like the last part of verse 23, and I think we all do. But I also like the verse 22 because it's showing that David trusted in God, that he did not blame God for the death of his child. David recognized the basic truth here. Because he says, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. Think about what David recognized. I can go to this child. Why is that? We often struggle with the fact that God allows precious babies to die. And people question, well, why can God allow that? But you think about the basic fact of the matter. Think about the problem of sin. So many claim that we are born sinners. Well, how can a baby be born a sinner? Sin is a choice. The Bible nowhere teaches that we are born sinners, nor that we inherit sin. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, nor shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. Every man bears his own sin, and we sin by choice. And can a baby, a child who does not know right from wrong, choose to sin? Absolutely not. The Roman Catholic doctrine of original sin and the Calvinistic doctrine that man is born totally depraved are some of the sickest doctrines ever concocted by mortal men. They claim to appeal to Scripture, but in reality they are twisting the Scriptures. Because nowhere does the Bible teach that we are born sinners or inherit sin, as we have stressed. You see, a baby is born innocent, in a safe condition. You see, David recognized the fact that that baby, that child, was going to be with God. Was going to go to heaven. He was safe in the arms of God. You know, and I think that's what we need to recognize today. That's what we need to teach people today. The simplest answer is this. That baby is in a better place. That baby, though we desired it to live, and it breaks our heart when babies die, they are in a better place. They are safe in the arms of Jesus. You see, David demonstrated here great faith. Instead of blaming God, he recognized that the fact that the child was in a better place correctly, and that he himself could go to the child. Instead of blaming God, he leaned upon God in times of sorrow. And this is where we see great faith on the part of David, do we not? Great faith. And again, I think we see the contrast between the behavior of David and the behavior of such men such as Dan Barker and Jerry Doyle, whom we quoted earlier. But then there are those who try to skirt the problem of God by trying to change God. They say, if there is a God, then he must be a finite God since evil exists. Harold Kushner, in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, regarding the Holocaust, he asked, where was God while all this was going on? And Kushner is a rabbinical Jew. He goes on to write, why did he not intervene to stop it? Why didn't he strike Hitler dead in 1939 and spare millions of lives and untold suffering? Or why didn't he send an earthquake to demolish the gas chambers? Where was God? As a result, regarding the nature of God, Kushner writes, there are some things that God does not control. In other words, Kushner says that God doesn't have the whole world in his hands, that God is not sovereign, and that God is not a just God. He goes on to write, are you capable of forgiving and loving God even when you have found out that He is not perfect? Since when does God need forgiveness? Since when did God become less than perfect? Can you learn to forgive Him despite His limitations? Kushner asks. So he attempts to change God into something that God is not. He attempts to make the God of heaven lesser than what He is. In fact, he's really saying He's not God at all. And thus, by his argumentation, Kushner is denying that the God of heaven exists. But that's what makes this a challenge for you and I tonight as Christians, is explaining why these things go on. However, I would suggest to you tonight that atheists, that skeptics have the same responsibility, because the very fact they consider evil and suffering troubling logically implies a standard of good, a standard of morality beyond this temporal realm, and this is where they get themselves into trouble. They claim their answers are more rational and logical than the answers from Christianity. Yet, as we will demonstrate, they are illogical and really irrational. Because when we examine God's Word, we will find that Christianity possesses the only sensible and real answers to the problem. Hence, we come now to the origination of evil. From whence comes evil? And again, we have the claim that they make that God has to be the source of all evil. And certainly, we again note their arguments. They say if God is and He is all-powerful, then God is the author, He is the creator of everything. And again, we do not deny this. But then they say that evil is something. And again, you and I do not deny the existence of evil. We all agree on this. But they say they falsify their conclusion by saying that God is the author of evil. Well then, if this is the case, then God did not create all things good as per Genesis 1. Remember, He looked upon the creation and saw that things were good. Remember what happened when He created Eve? He saw that it was very good. But if God created evil, then He did not create a perfect creation, according to atheism. However, what we need to recognize and consider is to understand the nature of evil. We remember that God is wholly good. He is opposed to all sin and evil. The prophet Habakkuk recognized God as that being of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. 1 Peter 1:15, God is holy, and thus as His people today, Christians are charged with living holy in an unholy world. And of course, Romans 11, verse 22, a lot of people forget that God is not just a good God, but He is a severe God. However, they might ask, well, why if God can't look on evil, well, why is it still occurring? Shouldn't He have already put an end to things? 2 Peter 3, verse 9 is a good answer to that. And remember, they base their arguments on attributes of God which are found in the Scriptures, and thus we have the obligation. We can defend the Scriptures ourselves. Remember 2 Peter 3, verse 9. God is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. You see, that's the key. God is long-suffering. He wants all men to be saved, 1 Timothy 2, verse 4. But then, even though we understand that, the principle of long-suffering, and He gives men opportunity after opportunity to get his life right, to submit to him. Men still don't. But then they might say, what about Isaiah 45 verse 7? They might say, doesn't that read, I form the light? Doesn't God say, I form the light and create darkness? I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Now, what about this? Well, in order to understand it, we have to also look at verses 5 and 6 of Isaiah 45, where God says, I am Jehovah. There is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. The idea of creating evil here does not refer to evil as we would think of it, that is, of immorality and sin, but rather punishment or calamity brought about because of evil. In other words, this verse refers to God's divine and righteous judgments and speaks of the distress and disaster which results from sin. In other words, God brought evil down upon the nation of Israel. He didn't bring sin and immorality because that's what Israel was guilty of. No, evil in this sense denotes calamity. God created evil in that He brought about the downfall of Israel in the form of divine judgment, punishment. So, understanding this a little bit better, was evil created or caused? Well, to say that evil is something that is a tangible object is to say that God created evil, if we hold that God created all things. Kevin Colley, in his excellent book, No Apologies, observes that evil is a privation or negation of that which is good. Good is defined by the character of God and by what God purposes for His creation in conjunction with His character. Remember the words of Christ in Luke 18:19, none is good save one, that is God. Take, for example, lying. God's character requires Him to always speak truth. It is impossible for God to lie. What is lying but a negation of truth? Murder is the unjustified negation of a human life. Respect for life is based in the character of God as one who is eternally alive. Evil is the pervasion of that which is wholesome for unwholesome purposes. In the ultimate sense, if God is the standard for good, then evil is a move away from God. It is saying no to God. So, evil is not something. Evil is not a substance. Rather, it is a deprivation of good. And again, Geisler formulates the argument thusly. The major premise is God created every substance. That's true. The minor premise is evil is not a substance. It's not something tangible. Therefore, the major premise is true, the minor premise is true, and the conclusion is valid and true. Therefore, God did not create evil. Objects are not created evil. And I'm going to explain that here in just a moment. Evil is not a substance. Geisler illustrates it this way. Evil is not a substance, but a corruption in the good substance God made. Evil is like rust to a car or rot to a tree. It is a lack in good things, but it is not a thing in itself. Evil is like a wound in an arm or moth holes in a garment. It exists only in another, but not in itself. Further, he explains that to say that evil is not a thing, but a lack in things, is not to claim that it is not real. Evil is a real lack in good things. Evil is not a real substance, but it's a real privation in good substances. It is not an actual entity, but a real corruption in an actual entity. Again, 1 Timothy 6:10. For the love of money is the root of all evil. And again, notice Paul did not say there, for money is the root of all evil. Money in and of itself is not evil. But man's attitude, his disposition toward it is what corrupts it. It is the love of money, not money itself, which is evil. Did God create this? Well, no, man chose it. Things become evil because they become corrupted or they are used corruptly. And these corruptions occur because men choose for them to occur. Again, you think about the battle we are facing today. So many people have this problem with guns. Are guns evil? That's what people would say, that guns are evil. Guns are not evil. Guns can be used for defense, self-defense. It is the hand that holds the gun that's the problem. You see, why are so many lives needlessly lost? Why are so many lives needlessly lost? It isn't the gun in the hand, or for that it isn't the gun, it isn't the knife, or and you could take this principle even further than this. It isn't the object in the person's hand that's the problem. It's the heart. When a person thinks evil in the heart, it's going to come out in their actions. Again, you could take a car. People take cars and run down people. Does it make the car itself evil? No. It's the person who's choosing to use that thing evilly, who's choosing to use it in an improper and an unlawful manner. That's evil. So we see it's the problem with the heart. Remember, Solomon said, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." And Christ said, what comes forth from the mouth comes forth from the heart. It's the man's actions which come forth from the heart that defile him. So that helps us understand. God created all things good, but we can use God's creation in evil ways because of our choices. Now, what do we mean now by evil? And again, it's referred to in two ways, as we briefly noted. There is natural and moral evil. And natural evil would include things such as natural disaster and refers to those occasions in nature that cause pain and suffering. Yet are these things really evil? Well, not in the strictest sense. However, there is moral evil which results from man's misconduct. It is that which is truly evil. Natural disasters are not evil per se, but rather calamities which strike mankind, which are in reality the consequences of choices men made long ago. Evil in its strictest sense, is sin. It's disobedience to God's will. Sin is the only intrinsic evil. Now, mankind has changed it from being sin to being pain and suffering. And again, an example that atheists and skeptics would use is Job. And they will say, well, how could a man who shunned evil, how can such a man, such a good and righteous man, suffer? Yet again, I suggest to you, the book of Job is a good source to show what is evil and to see the misconception of men. Again, we affirm that God again commended Job for being perfect or complete and an upright man who feared him and who shunned or eschewed evil. What we must understand here is that Job eschewed evil, that is, sinful things. Notice again as well, Job 30, in verse number 26. We're going to see evil used twice. When Job says, when I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. And there's a different sense in which evil is used. First instance, Job 1 verse 8, it's used for sin. Job eschewed evil, that is, he shunned sin. Here in Job 30:26, it stands for suffering. Events which happened to Job through nature and by choices of others. Atheism claims, see here, suffering is evil. And therefore, since God created all things, he must have created evil and therefore cannot be a holy, good God. And therefore, God does not exist. Job eschewed evil. He eschewed sinful things. Now we understand he did not eschew the evil events that occurred in his life because he had to endure those. You see, the evil's used in two different senses here. One sense for sin, the other sense for calamity or troubles and trials of life. And that's what we must understand is how this term is differentiated. And again, we have to understand that atheism's attempt to define and answer evil is self-defeating. C.S. Lewis, who's well known for his Chronicles of Narnia series, in his book Mere Christianity on pages 45 and 46, he answers why he came out of atheism. He says that my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Atheism, Lewis notes, turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. You see, that's what atheism does. It removes all value, all meaning from this life. And thus it cannot offer a sensible and logical definition as to what evil is without appealing themselves to an ultimate absolute standard, that being God and His Word. Thus, atheism defeats itself by asserting that there is an absolute standard of morality, of which they must deny in order for their system of belief to be true. Their argument requires they acknowledge one of two things. Number one, they have to acknowledge the existence of God as the ultimate source of right and wrong. Otherwise, how can they know what is right and wrong? But yet here they are saying that pain, suffering, evil is wrong. Well, how do they know that? Well, this is where they get themselves into a jam. But then number two, they would have to argue that good and evil simply do not exist, which is absurd, is it not? Can you imagine anyone saying that good and evil doesn't exist? Can you imagine how bad things really would be in this society if people made that claim? It truly would be anything and everything goes. So the question becomes, did God create evil? And the answer is no. But now the question is, how can we explain suffering? How do we explain all this pain and suffering? Why do we suffer? Well, we go back to the question, when did suffering begin? And we have the rational answer. Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3. Remember what God told Adam and Eve? The rule He gave them? Every tree in the garden you can eat of, except of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the day ye eat thereof of it, ye shall surely die. However, Satan comes along, verses 4 and 5, and he tells a lie. He tells Eve, ye shall not surely die. We see the reneging here. Satan changed God's word with one little word, N-O-T. He added to it. And we see the response to Satan's lie. Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They chose to do it. Now, what was the result? Well, you skip on down to verses 16 through 19, and the result was suffering. God drove them from their garden home. In fact, by disobeying God's command, sin is what brought about suffering. As a result, verse 16, woman would suffer in childbirth. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow in thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband. I tell you what, men, ladies will probably agree, and I know, when a woman's in labor, they are some of the, when they're in labor, when they're in pain and they grab your arm and they squeeze it, you've never felt the pain on my part quite like that. Now, I better stop right there, because the pain a laboring woman is in is unimaginable to me. Especially when they are delivering a child without an epidural. But that's pain brought about by sin. But then you also notice that there would be suffering and toil. And again, God pronounced a curse on the ground for thy sake. In sorrow thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth. And thou shalt eat of the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. There would be suffering and death. And so we see the results of Adam and Eve's choice. Sin entered the world, and the effects of sin are being felt today. And again, the consequence of certain things are still felt today. Again, you go on down to the days of Noah. God saw that the thoughts of men were only evil continually. And what did God do? He punished wickedness with a worldwide flood. Now, why is this so important? Why is this so important to note? Well, Brother Brad Bromling, in the September 1992 edition of Reason and Revelation, in an article entitled, "Who Sent the Flood?" writes, "While we may never know with precision what conditions prevailed between the Edenic period and the flood, it seems that the weather systems with which we are familiar were largely absent at that time. The fossil record bespeaks a period when the entire earth enjoyed a temperate climate. This storm-free era most certainly predates the flood. Since that event, since the flood, man has been imperiled by tornadoes, blizzards, monsoons, and hurricanes. Upon whom should we heap blame for the suffering resulting from such wrath? Is it fair to accuse God when He created man's home free from such things? In all honesty, the answer is no. Sin robbed us of our original garden paradise, and sin was responsible for the global deluge. So the question, could God have created a world without evil? The answer is, He did. But it is because of men that evil exists in this world, and as a result, pain and suffering. Now, why do we suffer? Well, there's many reasons. Because of the personal decisions we make, we choose to sin. Because of the decisions of others. You think about how many innocent lives are lost due to individuals, drunk drivers, choosing to get behind the wheel in a state of intoxication and as a result, hitting and killing an innocent individual. You think about how many innocent lives are lost while these drunk drivers get up and walk away from these crashes. We suffer because of the choices of generations. Because of Adam and Eve, we all die. It is in Adam all die, not spiritually, but physically. Their choice brought physical death into the world. You know, we can suffer because of natural law, gravity. What happens when you fall off a ladder? Well, you suffer pain, a lot of pain. You fall off a building, you suffer pain, most likely death. We suffer because of accidents, car wrecks, even in the workplace. You know, we see pain occur. Like last week, what happened in Bridgeport, the explosions at the alloy plant. You know, things that are out of our control. Sometimes we just do not know. You know, we don't know why some develop cancer or MS or Alzheimer's and not others. It's not the result of personal choice. It's not our choice that we develop cancer. We cannot know why. We simply do not know, and sometimes we suffer because we are Christians. And again, persecution brought to bear. And we are familiar with the passages. Now, pain and suffering are not intrinsically or inherently evil. However, they can become instrumentally evil. That is, when pain and suffering are used to hinder what is intrinsically good with one's relationship with God and one's fellow, it becomes instrumentally evil. Conversely, if pain and suffering are used to facilitate one's relationship with God and one's fellow, it is instrumentally good because it is facilitating that which is good. Paul used his pain and suffering to draw him closer to God. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul besought God thrice for him to remove his thorn in the flesh. But what did God tell him? My grace is sufficient for thee. Even in a Roman prison, Paul was able to say, even though he was suffering hardship, he still said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He used his pain, he used his suffering to draw closer to God. In other words, it is how one views pain and suffering that makes a difference. Pain and suffering can be used as a blessing or used as a curse. It becomes a curse if one allows such to drive them away from God or to deny that God exists. Now, why doesn't God stop pain and suffering, we might ask, very briefly? Well, we understand God is love, but yet we also understand that love allows freedom of choice. And thus our loving God allows us to have freedom of choice. It's how He created us. And again, this is rejected by so many. Epicurus argued if God wishes to prevent evil but cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he can prevent it but will not, then he is not good. But if he has both the power and the will to eliminate evil, then why is evil in the world? As we see, skeptics falsely assume that no good can come from evil and suffering being allowed in the world. It fails to see that God created us as free moral agents. Thus, if God wiped out evil, he would be circumventing man's free moral agency. And if he did that, then all we would be robots walking around. And as we pointed out, to do that would take away any glory God would receive in men if men automatically served him. But then, what is the purpose of suffering of evil in this world? We need to remember Romans chapter 8. In verse number 28, one of the great passages of the Bible that speak to us of God and his providence. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Not everything is good, but God can work even the worst of things together for our own good. You and I can be made better. And again, you see the life of Joseph. Look where he went from. He went from the prison, from the worst condition, to the palace. How did he wind up in such a place of prominence? Look at, God worked these events. Joseph suffered all sorts of hardships, being sold into slavery. But God used those events to work out for good. And Joseph even admitted that. In Genesis 50, verse 20. He told his brothers, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. This teaches me that God has the whole world in his hands. But it also shows to us that this world is not our home. Thomas B. Waring, in his debate with Anthony Flew, stated that this world is perfect for the purpose God had in creating it. God did not create it as some sort of hedonistic paradise. God did not intend for this world to be our eternal home. It is here for us to make our decision either for or against God. It was designed for man to inhabit, Isaiah 43, verse 7, and to prepare for his eternal home, Ecclesiastes 12:13. But you also note that God used suffering on the part of his Son to bring about the redemption of mankind. By wicked hands, Christ was crucified and slain. Well, why did Christ suffer? For our benefit. God used it to bring about our salvation. But then what are practical benefits? It allows God to cry out to men in the effort to lead them to him in becoming his children. It enables us to develop and grow in moral character. It enables us to develop and grow a strong faith in God. It enables us to grow in love for our fellow man. It helps us to better appreciate the love God has that we have for others and that which others have for us. It helps us to better appreciate God's love for us. Again, you look at him allowing Christ to suffer for us. It can draw us closer to God, but it helps us to keep things in their proper perspective. This world is not our home. There is something far better that has been promised to those who obey and are faithful to God, and that is heaven. So will evil and suffering end? And the answer is yes. The infinite power and perfection of God guarantee the eventual defeat of evil. Geisler notes the fact that it is not yet accomplished in no way diminishes the certainty that it will be defeated. When will it occur? At the last day, when Christ comes again to destroy the earth and all that is therein, to deliver up the kingdom to the Father, to bring about the final judgment of all mankind, and to render unto all their eternal destinies. There are many things in this life we may not or will not understand. Even some of the most faithful to God did not understand. Job didn't fully comprehend why he suffered the way he did. But yet, when we have complete trust in God's goodness, these things will not overwhelm us, though they may be difficult to endure. We sing this song farther along. Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder. Then there's another passage in the song, though we may wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year. Again, another song we often sing, trials dark on every hand, and we may not understand. There are things in this life I don't understand. Things in this life you don't understand. Why certain things happen. But let's be reminded that both the good and the evil encounter suffering in this world. It's not just limited to one class of people. The suffering we encounter in this sinful world has its place. It helps to motivate us to fulfill God's plan for us by seeing through faith's eye that better country, the city whose builder and maker is God, which is eternal. You know, there are many other passages we could allude to, and you've been great listeners tonight, and I know I've been a bit long-winded tonight, and I apologize, but I feel that this subject deserves this attention and to help us better understand. And a failure to understand that has resulted in so many people denying the existence of God, denying God, not willing to obey the gospel. If this lesson can help but one soul come to accept God and to obey the gospel, then my feeble efforts will have been worth it. I encourage you tonight, when life throws you a curve and life seems unfair, don't blame God. Don't blame God even when we don't understand it. Don't blame God when things may seem bleak. You see, when things are at their worst, that's when we need God the most. Turn to Him and lean upon Him because He cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. When you're at your lowest point, when it seems the world is against you, when you are in pain, when you are suffered, whether it's personal suffering or you've lost a loved one, cast all of your care upon Him, for He cares for you. He'll lift that burden. That's why Christ invites all to come. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. I will give you rest. If you're burdened by cares, if you're a Christian, if you're faithful tonight, and if you are burdened tonight, Christ invites you to cast your burden on Him. Don't let it drag you down. Don't let it drag you into unfaithfulness. If you're here tonight as a faithful child of God and you feel like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, hey, we're here for one another. We can pray with one another and for one another. We're all in this together. No man is an island. So lean upon Him. Lean upon one another as brethren. Remember the words of the old song, He ain't heavy, He's my brother. We are to bear one another's burdens. So fulfill the law of Christ. However, if you are an erring Christian, if you've allowed the things of this world to drag you away from God, please come back. Please recognize that God is not the source. It is the choices of men that have resulted in all the problems in this world, but also recognize that this world was never designed to be our permanent home. Eternity is far too long to spend this life away from God. Come back home. Rededicate your life to Him tonight, repenting, confessing sin, praying to God for forgiveness. If you've never obeyed the gospel, we encourage you to do that this evening. Having heard the word, believing it, repenting of your sins, confessing your faith in Christ, being buried with Him in baptism for the remission of your sins. Would you do that? If you're here tonight and you're burdened in any way, Christ wants to remove your burden. And you can do so right now by responding to the invitation as together we stand, as we sing.